We continue now at the top of Daf Pei Gimel Amid Beis in Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 83b. This Daf is sponsored by Alexander Rosenfeld in memory of Gershon ben Yaakov. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amid or a Daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amid, the Gemara noted that according to Rabbi Akiva, the halacha that obligation karbanos need to be brought from Chulin is not learned from the same source that the Mishnah brings, which is the pasuk of V'zavachta Pesach. And so the Gemara now asks that pasuk of V'zavachta Pesach, according to Rabbi Akiva, Mai Ovidle, what does he do with that pasuk? And the Gemara continues and answers, Mi boy leilech Rav Nachman. He uses that pasuk for the teaching of Rav Nachman, the Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avua, because Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avua said, Minayin lemoser haPesach shekarav shlamim. From where do we know that a residual carbon Pesach, it's not used for carbon Pesach, that it should be brought as a shlamim shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, V'zavachta Pesach laHashem elokecha tzon uvakar. It says that you're going to slaughter the carbon Pesach to Hashem, flocks and cattle. And so the Gemara says, "V'halo ein Pesach ba ela min hakavasum u'min ha'izim." What does it mean over here in the pasuk when it says tzon uvakar? It doesn't come from bakar. Bakar is cattle. It only comes from tzon. It only comes from kavasum and izim. The carbon Pesach only comes from sheep and goats. Ela moser haPesach yehei ledavar haba min hatzon u'min habakar. What it actually means is that the residual of a carbon Pesach that should only be offered, or that should be offered as something that comes from both flocks and cattle, meaning to say it should be offered as a carbon shlamim. But the Gemara continues and asks, "V'hamei hacha nafka?" But is that halacha really learned from here? But midi avua de Shmuel nafka, isn't it learned from the teaching of the father of Shmuel? T'chsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, Im min hatzon karbanu lezevach hashlamim. It says, if from the flock the carbon is brought as a shlamim, v'yamar avua de Shmuel, and the father of Shmuel says, davar haba min hatzon, something that comes from tzon, something that comes from the flock, yehei lezevach shlamim. That should be for zevach shlamim. That's exactly this halacha. The halacha is essentially saying what comes from tzon. It's talking about the carbon Pesach, and that should be a carbon shlamim. But before answering this question, the Gemara continues and asks another question, V'yakati mehacha nafka, still, is it really learned from here? We have yet another source, mehasam nafka, it's learned from over there, because v'hatanya, but we learned in a brisa, keves, it says in the pasuk, keves, this is by the parsha of Shlomim, it mentions keves, a lamb, l'rabos as ha'pesach la'aliyah, this pasuk, this word in the pasuk, which says keves, that comes to include the carbon Pesach, that the fat tail of the carbon Pesach is burned on the mizbeach. Kishomer im keves. Now, when it says in the pasuk im keves, it says if a lamb. So that's lahavi pesach she'avra shenoso. That comes to include a carbon Pesach whose first year has passed. Since it is more than a year old, so it's disqualified as a carbon Pesach. Another animal needs to be brought in its place. And so the pasuk is teaching how this disqualified carbon Pesach should be treated. And furthermore, ushlamim haboim machmas Pesach. Also, let's say you have a carbon shlamim that's coming due to a carbon Pesach. And that is a reference to a carbon chagiga. Sometimes the carbon chagiga was brought on the 14th of Nisan together with the carbon Pesach. And the pasuk of Im Keves is coming to say, L'chol mitzvah shlamim, that these karbanos, meaning the Pesach she'avra shenoso, and the shlamim haboy machmas Pesach are included, L'chol mitzvah shlamim, they're included in all of the particular mitzvos that apply to carbon shlamim. And what are those? Sheyatanu smicha u'nesachim, that they should require smicha, which is leaning upon the animal, and nesachim, which is libations, and u'tenufas chazav v'shok, and also the waving of the breast and the thigh. And kishuomer v'im eiz, and when it says in the pasuk, it says v'im A's, and if a goat, so then hifsik ha'inyan, that acts as an interruption. It interrupts the subject, and limed al ha'ez, and therefore this teaches regarding the goat, she'eino tuna aliyah, that does not require to have its fat tail burned on the mizbeach. And the point in bringing this is that a carbon Pesach she'avra shenoso, if that first year has passed, that essentially is a residual carbon Pesach that is offered as a shlamim. And so this is yet a third source for this halacha. And so why do we need three sources for the exact same halacha that the residual carbon Pesach is offered as a shlamim? And the Gemara continues and answers, Tolasa kroy ksiv, there are three psukim that are written and they're all needed for different scenarios. Chad la'avra zmano v'avra shenoso. One is talking about a situation where the time of carbon Pesach Pesach has passed and the year has passed, it's more than a year old. V'chad la'avra zmano v'lo avra shnaso, then one pasuk is for a situation where the time has passed, but it's not more than a year old, the age has not passed. V'chad, and then finally the last one is l'lo avra zmano v'lo avra shnaso. That's talking about a situation where the time has not passed and the year has not passed. And in this last of the three scenarios, even though it is still fit for a Karban Pesach, but still, if it is slaughtered and it is slaughtered shelo lishmo, not for the sake of a Karban Pesach, it actually becomes a valid Karban Shlamim. And the Gemara continues and explains Utzricha, and it's necessary to teach all three. Di'iyashminan avra zmano v'avra shna. So let's say, for example, we only taught that the time has passed and the year has passed, that it's a Shlamim. Misham di'idchile lagamri. That's because it's completely pushed off from being a Karban Pesach. Aval avra zmano v'lo avra shna. But let's say the time has passed, but not the year. T'chazi lePesach Sheni. So in such a situation, it actually would be fit for Pesach Sheni, which is a month later. So then Eimolo. So then maybe I would say not that it's not going to be a Shlamim. V'yashmin an Avra Zmano v'lo Avra Shnaso. Now let's say we only taught the case of Avra Zmano that the time has passed, but lo Avra Shnaso, the year has not passed. Di'irchi leimi Pesach Rishon. So over there, it's been pushed off from Pesach Rishon. Aval lo Avra Zmano v'lo Avra Shnaso. But let's say you have a situation where the time didn't pass and the year didn't pass, that it's even fit for Pesach Rishon, for being brought in the month of Nisan as a Karban Pesach. So Eimelo, so there I would say no, maybe it's not a Shlamim, and so therefore Tzricha, that's why all three psukim are necessary to teach again that these residual Karban Pesachs, they become Shlamim. Hadron Allah Chatoda Haisaba, we will return to you. Parak Hatoda Haisaba, this is the end of the 8th parak of Meseches Menachos. If you're enjoying these videos and this channel, please like, share, and subscribe, and take a look at the description box below to see how you can support this channel. And we will now begin the 9th parak of Meseches Menachos. And the parak begins with the Mishnah, Kol Karbonos Hatzibur V'Hayachid, all the grain that is used for the communal and the private offerings, talking about Karban Mincha, Boin Min Ha'aretz U'Mei Chutz La'aretz, that grain can come from Eretz Yisrael or Chutz La'aretz, Min HaChadosh U'Min HaYashan, it can come from the new grain or from the old grain, Chutz Min HaOmer U'Shtei HaLechem, with the exception of the Omer, which is barley, and the Shtei HaLechem, which is wheat. The Omer was brought again on the second day of Pesach, and the Shtei HaLechem, the 2 loaves, were brought on Shavuos, and those, She'inan Boin Elemin HaChadosh U'Min HaAretz, those only come from the new grain, and they only come from Eretz Yisrael. V'kulan Einan Boin Elemin HaMuvchar, and all of these, they only come min HaMuvchar, they only come from the choicest flour, Ve'ezehu Muvchar Shalahem, and what is considered to be their choicest, Machnis V'Zitcha Alpha Lesoles, Machnis and Zitcha, those are the foremost of fine flour, and Shnia Lehen, and then secondary to them, Afurim Bebika, the flower of Afurim in the valley, and Kol HaRatzos Hayu Kasheros, really all lands are valid, Elamikan Hayu Mivian, but it was from here that they would bring the grain. And the Gemara says, Masnisin delo ki haitana detanya. Our Mishnah does not follow the Tana of the following Brisa. The Brisa says, Omer haba min hayoshan. Let's say the Omer comes from the old grain. Kosher is kosher. And shtei halechem habos min hayoshan. And also the shtei halechem and shavuos that comes from the old grain. Kesheros, they are also kosher. Ela shachisar mitzvah. It's just that you're missing out on the mitzvah lechatchila, but it is still kosher. And Omer, where do we know that? By the Omer dechsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, Takriv es minchas bikurech. It says you're going to offer the mincha of your first grain, and that implies va'afilu mincha aliyah. One may even offer it from the old grain which is in the attic. And shtei halechem, and where do we see that? By the shtei halechem dichsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, it says mi moshvoseichem taviu, from your dwelling places you shall bring it, v'lo min chutz la'aretz, and not from chutz la'aretz, and mi moshvoseichem, from your dwelling places, v'afilu mincha aliyah, and again even from the attic, even from the old grain. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ha'afikte, but this pasuk, it's already used. It's actually already used to teach that the grain for the Shtei HaLechem may not come from outside of Eretz Yisrael. So if we're already using it to teach that it can't come from outside of Eretz Yisrael, how can we use it to teach also V'afilu min ha'aliyah? And to that, the Gemara says, Amar Kratz, because the pasuk says Taviu. It says in the pasuk that you should bring, and we learn from that, V'afilu min ha'aliyah, the word Taviu is an inclusion. It implies even from the old crop that is stored in the attic. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'haimi boile, but still, isn't this pasuk of Taviu, isn't that needed for something else? It's needed to teach, Shekol sha'atam mevi mimakom acher, harehu kazeh, teaches the halacha that anything similar that you bring from another place is like this. And Rashi Ksav Yad explains, Shekol Shata Mevi Mimakom Acher Chametz, anything that you bring from somewhere else Chametz, Yehei Kozet, should be the same as this, meaning Isaron L'chal. It means to say it's one Isaron per loaf. This we learned earlier. Lahave Lachmei Toda. That was coming to include the Lachmei Toda. That's talking about the loaves that are Chametz of the Lachmei Toda. It's one Isaron per loaf, and that was learned from this very pasuk. And the Gemara says to that, Imkain, if so, if that's all that we were learning from the pasuk, so lichtov kra tavi, then the pasuk could have just written tavi. My taviu, why does it say taviu? Shmami notarti, we can actually see two things from this word. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'haksiv reishis, but isn't it written reishis in the pasuk? Reishis means first, and that means that both the omer and the shtei halechem must come from the first crop, it must come from the new crop, so how can we even suggest that the old crop is kosher? And the Gemara continues and answers to that, L'mitzvah, that again just means it's a mitzvah l'chatchila to use the new crop, but it's not invalid if the old crop is used. But the Gemara continues and asks, Haksiv chadasha, but again, doesn't it say new? And by saying the word new by the shtei halechem, again, it sounds like it has to be the new grain. And the Gemara says to that, Haimi boile l'chidatanya, that's needed for what's taught in the following brisa. Rabbi Nosson, Rabbi Akiva Amru, Rabbi Nosson and Rabbi Akiva, they said, Shtei halechem habos min hayoshen kasheros, that the shtei halechem that comes from the old grain is valid. Umani mekayim chadoshen, so how do I fulfill the requirement which says chadosha, that it has to be new? That simply means shetei chadosha l'chol ha-menachos. It just means that it's going to be new, the new one of all menachos. And that simply means that no mincha can be brought from the new crop until the shtei halechem is offered on Shavuos, even if the shtei halechem itself is offered from the old crop. And the Gemara continues and says that the machlokas between our Mishnah and the two brises is limited in scope. Ad kan lo pligi ela b'chodesh. They're only arguing by the new grain, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Dalid Amud Aleph.